You can go ahead and turn to the book of Exodus. Book of Exodus. And we are in chapter 22 today, covering the whole chapter. All right, well, last week we learned a little bit about slavery. And the main thing that we got out of that was that the law of Moses made provisions for slavery in regards to paying debt. You know, it was important back in those days that people would have a way to pay their debt because they didn't have welfare. They didn't have ways to, declare bankruptcy and that sort of thing. And so debt still needed to be paid. And God made a provision that through slavery, that was one way that you could do that. And so the law of Moses permitted people, or Hebrews more specifically, to keep slaves, but at a maximum of 6 years. You know, that all debts had to be paid during that 6 years or sooner, and then they were to be let go. Now, of course, we're not going to talk about slavery that much again today, but it does actually play into what we're going to look at. And you'll see that as we get to that point and why there is some importance in that. Now, the other thing that we're going to discover in today's passage is that civil laws are built on top of the law of God. And I talked about that a little bit last week. But, basically God has declared these 10 commandments to man. And then our civil laws basically work off the top of that morality, right? Because those are good things. You know, even for those who might not believe in God, most people would agree that murder is wrong and stealing is wrong. And that's because God has put those moralities in our heart. Now, the law of Moses is the same way. You know, what we're going to see today is that the laws and the penalties for these laws were built on top of the 10 commandments. Let's see if this thing wants to cooperate today. It's probably going to crash. Okay. So I want to encourage you guys as believers this morning, you know, as we start to get into the law, you know, and you hear law after law, the temptation is to kind of go to sleep, you know, kind of just, why are we studying the law? Why are we having to hear about oxen and donkeys and all these strange things, you know? But I want to encourage you, you know, not to go to sleep and not to think that these things are not applicable, okay? And one of the things that's really applicable, I believe, is that these laws, even though we're not under the law anymore, they really show us the heart for God to care for his people. You know, that he cares about all these little details of our lives. You know, he cares that people aren't robbed or that things are fair. He really does. And although we're not under the regulations of those laws anymore, they're still very beneficial and show us the heart of God. And so one thing I want you to keep in mind as we go through this, be thinking about the law of God, the 10 commandments, because obviously those are still very important for us as Christians to live under the 10 commandments, to adhere to those laws because they're so morally important. And so what I want you to think about as we go through this is, well, what happens when me as a believer or you as a believer breaks those laws? Because in Jesus Christ, we are not under the penalty of those laws anymore. Amen? Mm-hmm. And hallelujah. Thank God that we are not under that death sentence anymore. But when we sin, when we break the law of God, death still occurs. And what I mean by that is that death can happen to things in our lives, like relationships. You know, I can commit a sin that can break a relationship. It can destroy my faith. I could commit a sin that could destroy my faith or lead me on the path to destruction of my faith. And we could think of a lot of things, you know, where committing sins against God will lead to death. Now, it might not lead to physical death. It could, might not. And it surely won't lead to spiritual death because I'm covered in Christ. But still, we want to avoid breaking the law of God. So let's go ahead and get into the scriptures. Now, today's going to be a little funny because we're going to take these in bite-sized pieces, okay? Because there are so many laws that are given, I don't want to read through a whole big section. So we're going to take, you know, a few verses at a time. So let's start by just reading the first four verses. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. And if he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the theft is certainly found alive, in his hand, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall restore double. All right, well, if you remembered from last week, we learned that we had a catch-all law. Do you guys remember that? And it was an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, right? That was one of the laws that God gave us as a catch-all, you know, meaning that whatever wrong you commit to another brother or sister, you have to restore that same thing to them. So if you punch out someone's eye, you lose your eye. Knock out their tooth, you lose your tooth. Kill their donkey, you give them a donkey. Okay, makes sense. But now what we see in this is that there's actually a stiffer penalty. And this is what I mean by the laws of Moses being built on top of the laws of God. See, what we're seeing in today's section is that we start to see the penalties of breaking the law. We see that there's retribution, penalties for breaking the law. And look at the severity of the laws that are broken here. You know, instead of it being a 1-to-1 penalty, here we see with oxen, it's restore 5-to-1. So if you were to kill a man's oxen, you would have to give him 5 in return. That's a 500% restitution, right? Pretty stiff penalty for killing an oxen. Now, many of the laws of Moses are kind of stiff in this sense, but not all of them. But one thing we have to consider, especially for that time, is that these animals, oxen, donkey, sheep, whatever they might be, were the livelihood of that person, right? If you were to kill a man's oxen, that would be like, you know, destroying someone's tractor today, you know? How are they going to plow now? How are they going to provide food for not only their family, but to sell, to make income? So that was a big deal. You know, it was a big deal back then. And so we see a little bit stiffer penalties. Now, we're used to this in our modern day civil courts. You know, we have different levels of penalties for breaking the law. And often these are according to the severity. You know, how severely are we intruding on someone else's right? And sometimes those penalties become more harsh because of that reason, right? You know, penalties for, say, like speeding or, you know, committing misdemeanors, you know, may or may not risk other people's lives. And so sometimes those penalties are not as strong. Now, one thing that the law talks about here is that if the perpetrator was not able to pay those 5 oxen or those 4 sheep or donkeys, that they would have to go into slavery. And I believe that's why Moses already gave us the outline of what slavery was to look like first, right? He said, this is the way to pay for your debt if you're not able to pay for it. Now, often we think about, if a guy already had 5 oxen or 5 donkeys, why would he need to steal another? Technically, he doesn't, right? But we know that greed gets the best of all of us. And so that temptation to steal that other animal is still there. But most often, people aren't going to have the 5 oxen to replace the 1. And so this would mean slavery. You have to pay your debts. All right, next section, verses 5 through 8. If a man causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed and lets loose his animal, and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. Verse 6. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns so that it stacked grain, standing grain, or the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. If a man delivers to his neighbor money or articles to keep, and it is stolen out of the man's house, if the thief is found, he shall pay double. Verse 8. If the thief is not found, then the master of the house shall be brought to the judges to see whether he has put his hand into his neighbor's goods. So what we're seeing here, we actually looked at this a little bit last week, and this is personal responsibility, right? God says that you're responsible for your house, your household, your animals, anything that's under your authority, you're responsible for. And this makes sense, right? This is only fair. If I let my animal loose and he eats my neighbor's grain, I should be responsible for restoring that grain. If I start a fire and it gets out of control, burns down my neighbor's grain, I should restore it. Simple as that. I have an example of living this out firsthand last spring, just right before they were placing lockdowns for coronavirus and stuff. We went to Idaho to help my in-laws to visit and to help them with some chores around their property. And one of those things was to burn weeds. And we kind of got 2 fires going at the same time because there was 2 of us, and they really started to get out of control, and they went right past the fence into the neighbor's lot. And I started getting really nervous. I'm like, we had the hose out, I got the shovel beating it, and but it made me realize, if we don't get this fire put out, this could be bad. We could have to pay to replace the neighbor's sprinkler lines, the fence that's now on fire, and all those things. But we would have been on hook for those damages, right? And of course, we lucked out because it just ended up burning other weeds, right? So the neighbors weren't angry, it was just their side of the ditch bank, that sort of a thing. But really, think about the heart of this. Really, Jesus said that, to love our neighbor as ourselves was the highest part of the law, and loving God with all of our heart. And so that's really the heart of this, isn't it? That I would care about my neighbor's animals, grain, their property. It doesn't matter, right? I want to be careful not to take anything from my neighbor, whether it be livelihood or simply luxuries. And so that should be our heart, to love our neighbor by protecting their things. Now, the last thing I want to draw your attention to in these few verses that we just read was that the master of the house was to be brought before the judges. So who were these judges? What are these judges that are being talked about here? Well, a few weeks ago, we learned that Moses' brother-in-law, Jethro, gave him the advice of putting in place 70 judges, right? And he recommended that so that Moses wouldn't have to carry the whole load of being judge of Israel. And so that's what it's reflecting to, or speaking of here, is that they would be brought before the judges of Israel. And those were the 70 men that we learned about before. Now, one thing that I believe is very beneficial of the law of Moses is that most of these penalties are predetermined. You know, they're spelled out ahead of time. If you break this law, this is what's going to happen. Now, we have a lot of laws like that today, but we also have a lot of laws that are very vague, right? Like your penalty could be 100 or 1,000, right? They give a range. Or, you know, we don't know exactly what the penalty will be for some laws because a judge will have to determine what those laws are. Now, with the law of Moses, mostly what you'll see is that they're all spelled out ahead of time. And then when you go before the judge basically just acknowledges that, yes, you have to pay that amount. Okay, so that's mostly what we see. But there are times when even the law of Moses, there is vagueness at times when a judge will have to be present to make a determination. And that's what we'll see in the next section. So let's read verses 9 through 13. Bless you.
I'm not sick.
For any kind of trespass, whether it concerns an ox, a donkey, a sheep, or clothing, or for any kind of lost thing which another claims to be his, the cause of both parties shall come before the judges. And whomever the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. If a man delivers to his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or an animal to keep, and it dies, is hurt, or driven away, no one seeing it. Verse 11, then an oath of the Lord shall be between them both, that he has not put his hand into his neighbor's goods, and the owner of it shall accept that, and he shall now make it good, or not make it good, excuse me. Verse 12. But if in fact it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner of it. If it is torn to pieces by a beast, then he shall bring it as evidence, and he shall not make it good what was torn. Okay, so one of the things that comes out of this section is lost property. So potentially you as an owner of anything really could lose something, right? You could be out grazing your animal, one wanders off, you lose it. That animal maybe joins another herd for your neighbor. So in some cases, things like that could happen. Well, it's not the other guy's fault or the other rancher's fault that sheep strayed into his flock, right? It's not his fault. But at the same time, it still belongs to the owner, right? That belonging still owns to the same owner, even if it was lost. And so what the law of Moses is saying here is that that animal should be returned to the rightful owner. However, the person who found the lost thing shouldn't be criminalized because they found something that was lost, right? Now, if they were aware that, hey, that's Jed's sheep, you know, I better return it. That would only make sense. And so the law of Moses gives us dealings or how to deal with these circumstances. That is that the man did not steal it. But this is one of those vague issues where a judge might have to intervene to determine, right? You know, how are you able to prove that that's your sheep? You know, was it branded? Was it marked somehow? Is it a different type of breed that you can prove that that's your animal? And those are the types of things where judges would need the wisdom, right? They would need wisdom to determine what's best or right for that situation, what's fair. And so God has used these judges in Israel to help determine and judge those issues. Now, the next two verses are similar, but it's in the realm of lending and borrowing. So let's read verses 14 and 15. And if a man borrows anything from his neighbor and it becomes injured or dies, the owner of it, not being with it, he shall surely make it good. If its owner was with it, he shall not make it good. If it was hired, it came for its hire. So in this case, you know, borrowing something from your neighbor and damaging it means that you need to replace it or you need to repair it, is more the kind of the thing for modern times, you know. Honestly, this is, one of those things that I always get really nervous about borrowing things from people, because I'm always thinking, this is going to be the time that it breaks. This guy's chainsaw has been working good for 5 years. The moment I fire it up, it's going to like explode or something. In fact, this even happened to me earlier this week. I had a couple cords of wood delivered, and the first cord I chopped by hand. The whole process, the whole thing by hand. And that night, my neighbor, he saw me out there chopping. He was like, hey, please borrow my wood splitter. Just use it, split your other cord that you have. And I was like, no, it's fine. The exercise is great. I'm good. I don't need to borrow it. And then I woke up the next morning. Couldn't even hardly grip my hands together. My back was, all out of whack, all sore. And so I'm like, hey, about that splitter. I would love to borrow that splitter about now. But I was really nervous, like, is this thing gonna break when I use it? Thankfully, it's very new condition. And one thing that I learned from my dad and some other relatives as well is that, when you borrow something, you bring it back in better condition than what you brought it for, So I tried to clean it up really nice for him and fill it up with gas and, just to be a good steward of it. But we are responsible for what we borrow. If we do break something, we need to replace it or fix it. And that definitely goes in line with the law of God. Now, I want to repeat one of the verses that I shared with you last week because Jesus actually commands us to lend to those who desire to borrow from us. Kind of interesting. It's Matthew 5:42, and it says, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So if somebody comes to you, and they want to borrow something, Jesus said, give it to them. Lend it to them. Let them use it. And the beautiful thing about this verse, or really about the heart of God in this, is that he wants us to share our possessions, right? He wants us to help each other out. And so this is really encouraging, because the Bible says that it's more blessed to give than to receive, right? And so when we share our things, that's an opportunity for us as the possessor of those things to become less attached to them too, right? So we are more blessed by lending something to our neighbor, and he's blessed because he doesn't have to split another cord of wood by hand. And so you kind of see both coins, in the Bible there, or both sides of the coin, excuse me. All right, now the rest of the chapter has to deal mostly with moral and ceremonial laws, right? We've seen a lot of penalties of breaking the laws. Now we're going to see moral and ceremonial laws. And the first one is a moral law in verses 16 and 17. So let's look at those. If a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. Okay, so just as before, this goes back to the moral law, doesn't it? Do not fornicate. Do not have premarital sex. That's what this verse is speaking of. Now, in our culture, we don't have a penalty for this, right? We don't have a law that's built on top of this saying that, having sex outside of marriage is a crime. We don't have that. But it is part of the moral law. We're not to do that. Now, for them, back in that time, for the Jews, really, all the Middle Eastern cultures were this way. They had much more strict rules regarding this very topic. You see, it was tradition that when a man would marry a woman, that he would pay a bride price. He would give gifts to the father of the bride to pay to marry that girl. Now, what this law is saying, that if he jumps the gun and have sex with her, he has to pay that bride price. just as if he was marrying her. In fact, often they were encouraged to marry. You know, they were encouraged to go ahead and marry if they went through with that sin. But it does leave an out for the father of the bride. You know, if he doesn't like the guy, if he was a creep or not good for his daughter, he can say, no, I'm not going to give you my daughter in marriage. And he would still have to pay the bride price anyway. And so that's what this law is saying. You know, that regardless, you have to pay the bride price as though you were going to marry her. Now, obviously, you know, we have a couple people being offended by this sin, right? But one thing I want to draw our attention to is God is really the one who's the most offended in these things, right? Especially when we consider sexual immorality. You know, often those crimes are not punished in our courts, but God sees them. God's offended by them, right? David realized this when he was lamenting over his sin with Bathsheba. And this is part of what he wrote in Psalms. He said, against you and you alone have I sinned and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak and blameless when you judge. See, David realized that it wasn't just himself and Bathsheba that he shamed, but it was God. He broke God's heart. It was mostly God that he had offended by committing that sin. And this is really applicable for us. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, as we consider the moral laws that we break, even as Christians, we have broken God's heart. You know, he's the one who's offended by what we have done. Let's look at a couple cases of capital punishment, verses 18 and 20. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lives with lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. Verse 20, he who sacrifices to any god except the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. Well, if you missed last week's message, or if you've never noticed it in the Word before, the Bible does condone capital punishment. You know, that there are some sins that are worthy of death. Here's 3 of them here. So let's look at these individually. The first is sorcery. The Bible does not condone sorcery in any form. Now, this really is another form of idolatry, right? It's worshiping, it's connecting in the spiritual realm to things. So why is it in its own category? You know, why isn't this just kind of looped into idolatry? Well, I think that there's a lot of things that have to do with the spiritual realm when we talk about sorcery, right? We're connecting with those spiritual forces, those forces of darkness, you know, and there's something to be said by that. You know, hopefully most of us have never dabbled in that sort of thing, but we've read stories of it. You know, you've heard of what happens to people sometimes when they start to delve into these things, you know. Often it can lead to demonic possession or evil spirits following you around, you know, when you delve into these practices or witchcraft, that sort of thing. And so I believe that it's in its own category because of that, you know, because of the powers of darkness that you unleash. And it can even be to the detriment of one's soul, right? Especially if they've never heard the gospel, they never turn their lives over to Jesus, that can be a problem. It could keep them from being saved. Now the second one, it's hard to believe that we have to have a law telling us not to have sex with animals. But this really shows us how depraved mankind is or can be. You know, when I read stuff like this, I'm just like, wow. We are so, so evil. Now, this was given obviously long, long ago, right? Over 2,500 years ago, this was given as a law. Now, when we think about that, you know, we live in a time where we're seeing moral decay. We're on this moral slide right now, you know, but this was given long ago, meaning that mankind was capable of this kind of darkness, sexually speaking, way before the modern times that we live in. But this is a really powerful thing to think about, because what we're seeing in our culture right now, especially just in the last 10 years, is that gay marriage has become more the norm, more on the rise, more accepted among everybody in society, even in the church. Now, I remember when they first wanted to get this legalized, when they were talking about it, and it really started to become a hot issue. I heard many people say, you don't want to do this. You don't want to give in to this immorality, because here's what will happen next. Then they're going to start pushing for pedophilia. They're going to start pushing for polygamy, right? Things like that. Once you start down that slope of sexual immorality, there's no stop sign. There's no stoplight, right? We just continue to go slide, slide. And so that same warning that was given to us then is still active today. Don't be surprised if you don't start seeing stuff that has to do with animals. And that is so grotesque to think about, that we might be bombarded with that. And you might even want to laugh at it and think, oh, surely that won't happen in my lifetime. It's here. You know, a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now, I never thought that I would see in my lifetime. Now, I knew by reading the Bible that it would happen. I just didn't think that it would happen that soon. It seemed like something that was very far, far off. And it seems like as we go down that slope, we just get faster and faster and faster, just plunging into sin and darkness. But I want to share with you an example of this, of something that just came out last week. Facebook created a survey. Well, I'll just quote what Fox News said. Here's the quote. Facebook is under fire for publishing a stomach-churning survey that asked users whether pedophiles should be allowed to solicit sexual pictures from underage girls. So this was a poll that they published on their media site. So that's the very warning that we were told about when they wanted to redefine gay marriage. And so we just continue down this slope. And where will it end? It'll never end until utter destruction, you know. The darkness of man is just so deep and so dark. Now, the last capital offense is idolatry. Again, remember, this is different than sorcery. Now, this obviously was put into the law for the nation of Israel, right? If you bow down and sacrifice to any other god or any other idol, you shall be put to death. Pretty strong penalty, the death penalty. Now, this penalty is kind of interesting because this was practiced at times by the Israelites, but they pretty much went away from it very soon. And do you know why? Because they all started worshiping idols. See, when a nation or a people group starts to commit those sins, they don't want it to be a penalty anymore, right? And again, that's what we're seeing in our modern day and age. They want to make things that have been illegal for ages, since the Constitution was written, they want to make them okay now because they want it to be the norm to practice these things. And that's the same thing that God is saying there. But it was abandoned. They gave up on it. In fact, we see even today, right, in modern religions around the world, that idolatry is still practiced. Not only has it ceased being a penalty, it's not even, I mean, it's encouraged now, right? They encourage you to bow down to statues and paintings and bow before altars, that sort of thing. Let's look at some acts of compassion. I like when we get to the acts of compassion, you know, because we get to see God's heart, you know, that he is a compassionate Lord. Verses 21 through 24. You shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry out or cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. All right, in verse 21, it's actually repeated several times throughout the Bible. For Christians, we are called to show hospitality, be welcoming to strangers. This goes for our homes, for church, our community, and even our nation. This is a big deal to God, you know, to treat strangers with respect, to show them hospitality. And, you know, in our country, we have immigration laws, for instance, right? Where people are supposed to, if they want to immigrate to this country, they have to go through a legal process to do so. But even we as Christians are called to be kind and hospitable to the stranger, even if they are here illegally. You know, and I know that sometimes it is a difficult thing to do. But as Christians, that's what we're called to do, to care for the stranger. The law of Moses also instructs us to be compassionate on orphans and widows. You know, these two people groups are two of the most fragile when it comes to society and poverty, orphans and widows. And God says that we're supposed to care for them, not mistreat them. In fact, he goes as far as to say, if you mistreat widows and orphans, I will kill you with the sword. I will personally come after you because you have not shown my heart for people. Now, this is actually echoed in the New Testament. You guys might be familiar with this, but James says that pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble. So this is a truth that goes across the Old and the New Testament. You know, God's heart for those who are unfortunate. So God didn't change in that. The poor, verses 25 and 27. If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a money lender to them. You shall not charge him interest. If you are even to take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So just like lending or borrowing possessions, God says, I want you to do the same thing with your money. Be willing to lend your money to someone who's poor or in need. You know, the cool thing about this is that potentially, if we were to lend money to someone who was poor, or speaking of within the law here, they might not have to become a slave at that point. You know, if you were able to help them get by so that they didn't have to serve as a slave, that would be a pretty awesome thing. But God says here that you're not supposed to be like a bank. You're not supposed to charge interest, right? If you need to lend them 30 pieces of silver, you do that and then only expect 30 back. Just like you lent your wood splitter, you get your wood splitter back. So pretty powerful thing of really showing God's heart. I want to share with you what Jesus said on this matter. In Luke 6:34 and 35, he said, "And if you lend to those who you hope to receive back, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back." That's there. "But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the unthankful and evil." So see, Jesus gets down to the heart behind this law, right? And that's that we should be givers. And even sometimes not even expecting in return. You know, maybe you do lend money to somebody, but then you just say, you know, it's all right. Don't worry about paying it back. All right, let's finish up the chapter. "You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. Likewise you shall do with your oxen and sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat meat torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs." So in verse 28, the law states that you are to not revile God nor curse any ruler of the people. Now, these rulers were speaking of the judges in Israel, right? But this still goes for us today, the rulers that are in power. And I don't like that. No, I'm kidding. It is a challenge, though. Let me tell you, it is a challenge. But this is repeated. If you search up to show respect to the leaders, it'll come back with like 30 verses through the Old Testament and New Testament alike. You know, that we are to show respect to those that God has allowed to be in power. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why are they in power? Well, we don't know what the purpose of God is in that. Sometimes we might know, other times we might. But see, he could allow a bad emperor, king, governor, judge to come into power as a judgment on the people that he's ruling over. But he could do the flip side too. He could allow a good king, a good emperor, a good governor, a good president to come into power to bless people. He could allow communism to come into an area so that the gospel grows, so that people get saved. It's hard for us to imagine, but we see it happening in communist China. You know, the gospel is on fire over there. It's all underground. It's all quiet because it's illegal. But even under those circumstances, the gospel is cruising. People are getting saved. They're saying that even in the Muslim world, that many are coming to Jesus. They're having encounters with Jesus in their dreams while they sleep. You know, they're not hearing the gospel preached on the streets. Christians are, in fact, being murdered in those areas, but people are still coming to Jesus. So we have to trust him and whatever political climate that he's created, that's the best for now, or the best for us for that time. I want to share just one of those verses with you. It's found in Daniel 2:21. This is what it says. "And he changes the times and the season. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." And again, that's what we see, is that God has a plan to who is in power. He either raises them up or he takes them out. And that's all according to his plan. Now, the other thing we see in this section is that God calls us to give up our first fruits, right? Our firstborn, even. Not that we're to sacrifice them, but we are to dedicate them to the Lord. What this means is that we're supposed to give the best to God. You know, whether it's the best time that we have in the day, our best valuables. Whatever our best is, that's what we want to give to God. Give the best to the Lord. And that's what they were instructed to do, you know, to give the first fruits, the best crops, the best animals, those without blemish. My old pastor, Troy from Meridian, he used to always have a saying, you know, that often when people give to the church, they just want to give their cast-offs, you know. Hey, I've got this old couch, you want it? Got this old refrigerator, you need it? That kind of thing. And see, what God's heart was, give the best, you know. I'm not telling any of you guys to do this, but, you know, buy a new refrigerator for the church. You keep the old refrigerator, you know. We're good, our refrigerator's working fine. It's just an example. But finally, we're told here in this section is that we are to be a holy people, right? So it comes back to sanctification, like we've seen weeks past. And it's kind of interesting because we get this strange saying that says, don't eat meat of an animal that was shredded by a wild beast, right? If you find an animal that was killed in the wild, don't eat it. And it sounds kind of funny, you know, what's that all about? Well, honestly, what I believe that God is trying to tell us there is that we shouldn't be like wild animals. It's just one example of it, right? We're not supposed to live like animals. Not supposed to sleep with them. We're not supposed to eat them when they've been murdered by another animal or devoured by another animal, right? He's calling us to live holy lives. And that seems simple, that seems straightforward, but look at how animalistic people are starting to live like, you know? It's not a far stretch, right? It's almost like we're regressing into caveman politics and lawlessness. It's crazy. But God has called you and I to be holy. You know, be holy as our Father in heaven is holy. Amen. Let's close with a word of prayer. And